There are moments when you realize that you've always been wrong. You can spend years believing that you know a place, that you know its every nook and cranny, that nothing can surprise you. But it only takes one detail, one single detail out of the ordinary, for everything to become strange, unsettling. And when that happens, the feeling doesn't go away anytime soon. Good evening, Leandro. Good evening to all the viewers. I would like to share with you a story that happened to me a few years ago. I ask you to keep my name anonymous, but I can tell you that this story took place in France, where I worked as a night concierge in a public school. It was a quiet job, and I loved the routine. My job was simple. Make sure everything was in order, walk around the building, check the security cameras, and lock the doors. The silence of the night has always comforted me, and I enjoyed being alone. I carried a small radio with me, listening to music as I wandered through the hallways. To be honest, I felt like the place almost belonged to me at those hours. But I wasn't completely alone. Gasper, my dog, accompanied me. He was a well-trained Belgian shepherd, one of those working dogs that are alert to any suspicious movement. At first, I thought the school wouldn't accept his presence, but to my great surprise, the administration saw the idea in a good light. They told me he could help if someone tried to enter the building, and that it was an additional security measure. For weeks, our routine went smoothly without incident. Gasper remained always vigilant, but showed no signs of discomfort. I already knew all the noises the structure made with the wind, all the strange reflections of the outside lights in the windows. Nothing frightened me until one night I realized my tranquility had been naive. It was a subtle change, one I only noticed because Gasper reacted first. He had always been calm, but that night, as we were walking down the main corridor, his body stiffened. He stopped walking and stared at one of the classroom doors. Then he began to growl softly. I stopped beside him, trying to understand what was wrong. I looked through the glass of the door, but the room was empty. There was no light on, no movement. Gasper remained motionless, the hairs on his back standing up, his growls intensifying until they turned into aggressive barking. Something he never did without reason. My first reflex was to believe that someone had broken into the building. The school was fairly secure, but it was an old building after all, and there could always be an unnoticed entrance. I took my flashlight, unlocked the door, and pushed it open cautiously. Gasper entered before me, as if heading straight for the source. He ran to the middle of the room and barked angrily, his eyes fixed on a specific point, but there was nothing. I swung the flashlight around, searching every corner. Everything seemed in order. The desks were aligned, the cabinets closed. The room was like any other, but Gasper refused to leave. He slowly backed away, barking at close intervals, as if waiting for a reaction. I tugged on his collar, but he resisted. It was as if he saw something that I couldn't see. I closed the room and decided to return to the surveillance room to check the camera footage. I wanted to understand what had upset Gasper so much. When I fast-forwarded the images to the exact moment we crossed the hallway, my stomach turned. The camera had captured everything. You could see Gasper stop walking, his body freeze, but that wasn't all. Before he even had time to react, something appeared on the screen. At first, it was an interference, a slight distortion of the image. But as the seconds passed, the shape became clearer. It was a silhouette tall, wide, immobile. You couldn't see the face, just the shadow. For a moment, I thought it was a camera error, a reflection, something like that. Then the silhouette disappeared. It vanished completely and reappeared inside the room, right where Gasper had been barking. The blood froze in my veins. I tried to find an explanation, to convince myself that it was a problem with the system. But Gaspar's reaction told me otherwise. He had sensed something I had never realized before. The next morning, I showed the footage to the school administration. They watched in silence, and at the end, one of the directors simply said it must be a camera issue. They told me to delete it and asked me not to mention it to anyone. I didn't push further. I simply made my decision. I resigned the same week. That night, as I left the school after my shift, I felt a strange relief. For years, this building had been a safe environment, a space I knew like the back of my hand. But suddenly, every corridor seemed different, as if something had always been there, simply waiting for me to notice. Gasper was still agitated as we headed home. He kept turning every few meters, growling softly. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't help thinking that maybe I had made a mistake by working there for so long without questioning certain things. The next morning, when I went to the administration to hand in my resignation letter, I expected some resistance, but there was none. They simply thanked me for my service and asked how long I could stay. I agreed to work one more week, mainly because I wanted to see if anything else would happen. The following nights were silent, no incidents, no strange noises, but I felt a subtle presence, as if the building itself had taken on a different weight. I tried to follow the same routine as before, listening to music and making my rounds. But the atmosphere felt displaced, as if someone was always one step ahead, erasing their tracks before I could notice. On the fourth night, Gasper stopped barking in the room that had bothered him so much. Instead, he was fixated on the door to the basement. I had never needed to go down there because it was only used to store old materials. But that night, Gasper reacted differently. He didn't growl. He simply stared at the door, attentive, as if waiting for something to happen. I opened the door slowly. The air inside was dense, with that characteristic smell of dust and old wood. I turned on the light and began descending the narrow stairs, feeling Gasper behind me. The basement wasn't large, and the shelves were filled with old textbooks, boxes of archives, and a few pieces of furniture covered with sheets. I walked between the shelves without any apparent reason, just to see if anything was out of place. Gasper walked beside me, his heavy breathing echoing in the enclosed space. That's when I noticed that at the back of the basement, one of the shelves had been slightly moved. I stopped for a moment. The floor showed fresh marks, as if someone had moved the shelf to access something behind it. I approached slowly, and with some effort, I pushed the structure aside. Behind it was a door. I had never known there was a room in this spot. The construction plan I had received when I was hired only indicated the basement, but there it was, an old wooden door. No visible lock, just a worn iron handle. I hesitated for a moment, trying to decide whether to open it or not. But Gasper had already made his decision. He backed away, lowering his ears, his eyes fixed on the wooden door. Something was bothering him in there, and for some reason, that was enough to make me step back. I turned off the light and returned to the main hallway, closing the basement door behind me. I stayed awake until dawn, replaying the camera footage over and over in my mind, trying to find a moment when someone had entered the basement without my noticing. But there was nothing. The next morning, I shared my discovery with the school director. He listened in silence, and when I finished, he simply said that I shouldn't worry. The school is old, he said. There are many things here whose history even we don't fully know. That was the only explanation he gave before thanking me again for my work and wishing me luck for the future. I left with the feeling that I should never have looked at that door. On my last day of work, I made a decision. There was something wrong with this school, and even though I couldn't prove it, I needed to better understand what was going on. Since finding that door in the basement, a growing unease had taken hold of me. It was as if now that I knew it existed, something wanted me to go back. Gasper felt the same way. Every night, he refused to approach the stairs leading to the basement, stopping in the hallway, his body rigid, his ears lowered. I waited until 2 a.m., knowing that no one else would come. I turned off the radio and walked to the basement entrance, feeling my own breathing grow heavy. I descended the stairs cautiously, the fluorescent light flickering, casting irregular shadows on the shelves. Gasper stood at the top of the stairs, watching without taking a single step forward. The bookshelf covering the door was still slightly moved, as I had left it, but now the door was ajar. The air inside the basement felt different, charged with something hard to explain. All my instincts told me to turn back, to get out of there and forget what I had seen. But it was too late for that. I approached and slowly pushed the door open. It creaked loudly and unpleasantly, revealing a small, dark room. I took out my flashlight and used it to illuminate the interior. It was a cramped space, windowless, with old, damp stone walls. The first thing I saw was a stack of boxes in one corner, filled with old documents and books. But what froze me was what was on the opposite wall. Marks, deep scratches in the stone, scattered in a disorderly manner. Some lines were long and continuous. Others were short and violent enough for me, even unintentionally, to understand what it meant. Someone had been trapped in there and was trying to get out. A bitter taste rose in my throat. I took a step back, feeling a cold sweat trickle down my neck. My mind tried to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. What was this place? Why had the school never mentioned the existence of this room? My flashlight wavered slightly in my hand. That's when I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound footsteps. They were coming from upstairs. Someone was on the ground floor. I turned off the flashlight and held my breath, trying to listen more carefully. Gasper was still at the basement entrance, and I knew he would bark if it was someone he didn't recognize. But he didn't bark, which troubled me even more. I stayed in the darkness for a long moment until the silence resumed. I decided I had seen enough. I left the room and closed the door as carefully as possible, feeling a weight in my chest with every second I spent in that room. I pushed the bookshelf back into place and quickly climbed the stairs, finding Gasper exactly where I had left him. He looked at me strangely, as if he knew I had made a mistake. The next morning, I handed in my keys to the director and left without looking back. But even after weeks, my mind remained stuck in that basement, on those marks on the wall. The days that followed were strange. Even after leaving my job, I felt like the school was still there somehow. I tried to follow my routine as usual, but sometimes I woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that I had forgotten something important. Small details about the school kept coming to mind: a door always locked, a hallway where the lights took too long to turn on, the way some teachers avoided certain topics when speaking to me, and the basementist. Every time I passed by that part of town, my gaze was inevitably drawn to the school's facade, and each time the same question came to mind: what really happened there? I thought about trying to find information about the building's history, but part of me didn't want to know the answer. Everything I had seen in that room was enough to make me realize that something had been hidden there for a long time. Gasper also changed after that night. He had always been an attentive dog, but now he became more agitated than ever. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would simply prick up his ears and growl softly, staring into a corner of the room as if waiting for something. I never saw anything, and perhaps that was for the best. Time passed, and the school continued to function normally, as if nothing had happened. The children ran through the hallways, the teachers gave their lessons, the directors followed their routines. But I knew that somewhere in that building, something was still buried, and I no longer wanted to be a part of it. I never went back there, not until now. I've never told this story to anyone, but every time I think about those marks on the wall, I wonder how many other hidden aspects exist, and how many stories have never been told. Life has a curious way of confronting us with the inexplicable. No matter how much we rely on reason, concrete data, and absolute logic, there are moments that defy even the most skeptical among us. I've always believed that everything has an explanation, that there are no true mysteries, only flaws in human perception. But when certain events occur, when they accumulate, and when different witnesses report similar experiences, it becomes impossible to ignore them. Good evening to everyone present on the channel. My name is Thomas. I've been a math teacher for 19 years, and I've always been a man of science. Skeptics like me seek evidence, not sensations or impressions. But what I experienced a few years ago in a school in the suburbs of Strasbourg changed the way I see the world, not because I came to believe in the supernatural. That still seems absurd to me, but because I realized that there are things that defy our immediate understanding. What happened to me and my colleagues is very real. Before I continue, I'd like to ask you to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It's very important so that more people can be informed about stories like this. Let's move on to the story. I accepted the position at the school without asking too many questions. It was a secondary school structured in 3 buildings, located in a quiet neighborhood. I only learned later that years ago, the site had been a psychiatric hospital. This didn't bother me. Buildings change functions all the time, and I didn't see why I should dwell on such a detail. I remember very well the first time I felt that something strange was going on in this place. It was winter, and as usual, night fell early. It was very cold. That afternoon, I had to leave my classroom to fetch the attendance list from the office. To do so, I had to cross the courtyard toward building 2. Before entering, I looked up for some unknown reason. My gaze was fixed on the window of the 3rd building, which was only used for workshops and was completely empty at that time. An old woman was standing there, looking down. I couldn't make out her features because the interior of the building was dark, but the courtyard lights illuminated her enough for me to see her silhouette. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to understand what I was seeing. This building was always locked. Who was this woman? When I reached the office, I told the secretary what had happened. She frowned and assured me that there was no one there. She said she would send the janitor to check and suggested I not worry. I did as she suggested and returned to my class. Later, as I was leaving the school, the secretary caught up with me. She told me that the janitor hadn't found anyone in the third building. All the doors were locked. It was impossible for anyone to have gotten in. I laughed a little nervously and said that I might have been mistaken, but she just shook her head and warned me, "It happens. I sometimes see or hear strange things here, but don't worry, you'll get used to it with time." After this conversation with the secretary, I tried to continue my routine as if nothing had happened. Work is work, and I didn't have time to lose myself in thoughts about something as subjective as a possible optical illusion or misunderstanding. However, there was something troubling about the way she spoke, the tone of someone who is used to such situations. Days passed without further incidents. Gradually, however, I realized that I wasn't the only one who had noticed strange things in this place. Colleagues sometimes commented casually, sometimes more seriously, about events that seemed to have no explanation. One evening, I went to the teacher's restroom. The building was already quiet, and only a few members of the staff were still. There, as I was washing my hands, I heard laughter. It wasn't ordinary laughter. It seemed to come from the hallway and had something strange about it. It wasn't the laughter of a student, but of someone older, almost forced, as if imitating an emotion they weren't feeling. I turned around in the mirror, but the bathroom was empty. I took a deep breath, convincing myself that it might have been a noise from outside. As I exited, I ran into a colleague, Julian, a teacher. He noticed my expression and asked if I was okay. I told him what had happened, trying to pass it off as a silly curiosity. But to my great surprise, he didn't laugh. He simply said calmly, "Strange things happen here. Strange things happen here. You're not the first to notice." He told me that a few weeks earlier, he had heard footsteps behind him in an empty hallway. He stopped and waited, but no one came. He added that, at other times, he had smelled a strong odor of disinfectants, something reminiscent of hospital products in rooms that hadn't been cleaned recently. I didn't know what to say. Until then, I had thought the stories circulating in the school were exaggerations or coincidences, but the more I heard, the harder it became to ignore them. The next incident involved two students. One random afternoon, two boys arrived late to my class, accompanied by the janitor. I was surprised because we never allowed such lateness without justification. The janitor asked me to step out for a moment and explained that the boys had been stuck in a room in the third building. The door had closed by itself, one of the students recounted, still pale. We tried to open it, but we couldn't. No one locked the door. The key was with me, the janitor added. If it had been an isolated case, I might have doubted it, but I had heard too many testimonies to consider it a simple coincidence. I let the boys into class, but internally, I felt an uneasy discomfort that was hard to explain. As the semester progressed, strange events accumulated. Some were minor, almost imperceptible objects that seemed to change places, doors that creaked without an apparent reason. others were more unsettling. Once, a female student emerged panicked from the restroom. She was visibly shaken and could barely speak. When we finally calmed her down, she said she had seen bare feet under the door of the neighboring stall. Thinking someone was there, she waited, but the feet were gone. They had simply disappeared. That was enough to make the atmosphere even tenser. At first, we avoided seriously discussing these events. It was easier to consider them jokes or made-up stories. But over time, it became impossible to ignore them. Something was off about this place. The turning point came on a particularly cold December evening. The semester was nearing its end. Classes were lighter, and many students had already started skipping class. It was a Thursday, and I had stayed late to grade exams in the teacher's lounge. When I finished, the building was almost empty. Only the secretary and the janitor were still there. I gathered my things and headed toward the exit. But as I passed through the courtyard, I felt an odd unease. It was a physical sensation, a chill running down my neck, as if the air was thicker around me. I paused and instinctively looked toward the third building. There, on the upper floor window, was the same old silhouette I had seen at the beginning of the semester. This time, however, she seemed clearer. Her posture was rigid, almost artificial, and something about her presence made me feel a weight in my chest. I knew the floor was locked. I knew there shouldn't be anyone there. My first reaction was to rationalize maybe it was a reflection, a trick of the light. But before I could convince myself, the silhouette moved. It wasn't a normal movement. She seemed to have simply shifted positions without turning or walking, as if she had glided within the room. I took a step back, my heart pounding. I'm not the type to get spooked easily, but this wasn't normal. Then I heard a noise. It came from the corridor next to the courtyard, near the outdoor restrooms. Sharp sound, as if something had fallen. By pure reflex, I turned my face toward the source of the noise. When I looked back at the window, the silhouette was gone. I didn't run, but I walked quickly toward the exit. I passed by the office and saw that the secretary was still there, sorting papers. I wanted to ask her if she had ever seen something similar, but I hesitated. We had already talked about it, and deep down, I knew she already knew the answer. "Good night, Thomas," she said, looking up. "Take care of yourself." I left without looking back. The next morning, as I arrived to teach, I learned that something had happened early in the morning. The janitor, who usually did a round before leaving, had found all the chairs in the teacher's lounge overturned, as if someone had deliberately knocked them over. The administration worried about a potential break-in, but nothing had been stolen. The security cameras, installed only in the main hallways, recorded no entry or exit. The atmosphere among the teachers changed completely. No one spoke openly about it, but the exchanged glances said a lot. Something was happening, and it was no longer possible to pretend nothing was wrong. After that night, something changed in me. What had previously been just a series of strange events became a constant weight. The feeling that this place shouldn't be a school grew stronger. More and more teachers discreetly shared similar experiences. No one wanted to admit it directly, but everyone knew something was wrong. I finished the semester and was transferred to another school the following year. To be honest, I didn't regret the change. I wanted to leave this place behind. Shortly after, I learned that the entire school had been relocated to a newer, more central building. The official reason was structural, but my former colleagues, and I knew what it was really about. Today, the buildings stand abandoned once again. I've seen recent photos, and the third building is already showing signs of wear. Asterisk, the windows are dirty. Some doors have been torn off, and nature is starting to reclaim its territory. But what bothers me the most isn't the state of the building. It's the feeling that it was never truly emptied. Every time I think about it, I wonder if, at some point, someone will try to reuse this space. How long will it take before new reports emerge? I don't know if a logical explanation can cover everything that happened there, but I do know that whatever it is, I wouldn't want to be there to find out. Memory is a treacherous labyrinth. Sometimes we relive events we wish to forget, but there are stories that insist on staying with us, returning in moments of silence like a distant echo. What I'm about to tell you today happened to me a few years ago, and to this day, I haven't found a satisfactory explanation. Good night, everyone. Good evening to all the viewers on the channel. My name is Mark. I'm French, but I've lived in Germany for many years. I've worked as a nurse for over a decade, and like many other professionals, I've seen things I'd rather not remember. But nothing compares to what happened during a night shift at an old hospital in Hamburg. Before I continue, I'd like to ask you to leave a like on the channel and subscribe. Your support is very important so that stories like this can continue to be shared. I started my career in private hospitals, where everything seemed more organized and predictable. But in 2018, I received an offer to work in a public hospital that urgently needed professionals. The salary was attractive, and even though I knew the workload would be heavier, I accepted. The hospital had been built in the early 20th century, and despite renovations, it retained a particular atmosphere. From the first day, I noticed that the hallways were narrower, and the windows, though large, didn't seem to let in enough light. The building had a disused wing on the 7th floor that no one talked much about. The hallways ended with locked doors, and the few people who had worked there the longest avoided giving details. I asked a colleague about this part of the hospital, but he simply shrugged and changed the subject. During the third week, I was assigned to the night shift. It wasn't my preference, but I had no choice. I arrived at 10 p.m. and exchanged a few words with the receptionist, a kind woman named Katerina. The janitor, an older man named Walter, was sitting near the entrance. At the end of the hallway, I saw a patient walking alone, which surprised MIT was rare to see someone wandering unaccompanied. I continued my routine, registering patients and checking medical records. Around 2 a.m., I went to the elevators to go to the ground floor and retrieve medications left in storage. The elevator was descending from the 7th floor, which intrigued me because that wing was supposed to be deactivated. The doors opened, and to my great surprise, the elevator was empty. I stood still for a moment, feeling unease growing inside me. I pressed the button to go down, but something made me look at the digital screen indicating the floor. For a second, I thought I saw a strange reflection in the metal doors. Perhaps it was just fatigue. When I reached the ground floor, I picked up what I needed and returned to my post, trying to ignore this strange feeling. But it was only the beginning. That same night, after the elevator incident, I tried to focus on my work. I still had several tasks to complete before the end of my shift, and I didn't want my mind to be clouded by this strange feeling. However, even though I tried to ignore it, something deeply bothered me. My colleague on duty that night, Elias, noticed I was agitated. He had been working there longer than me and seemed more accustomed to the oppressive atmosphere of the hospital. When we crossed paths in the hallway, he gave me a curious look. "You okay, Mark? You look a bit pale." I hesitated before answering. I wasn't sure if I should tell him what had happened, but I finally decided to do so. "Have you ever seen something strange in the elevator? Something that shouldn't happen?" Elias stopped walking and looked at me more closely. After a brief silence, he sighed. "You're not the first to notice," he said in a low voice, "but my advice, don't look for it." His response only increased my unease. Before I could ask anything else, an urgent call came over the intercom. A patient in room 312 had tried to get up alone and had fallen. I rushed to help, and the conversation with Elias was postponed. The night went on normally until 4:30 a.m. when I went to get coffee in the break room. The hospital was silent, with only the occasional sound of equipment filling the hallways. Fatigue was weighing on my shoulders, but something made me glance at the elevator control panel as I crossed the main hallway, and there it was again. The same elevator from earlier was on the 7th floor. This time, I stood there, watching the minutes pass, and nothing happened. The elevator didn't descend. It didn't move. It was frozen there, as if someone had called it, but it had never left. My heart raced. It could have been a technical issue, of course, but the feeling that something was wrong was too strong to ignore. Without overthinking it, I decided to investigate. Memory is a treacherous labyrinth. Sometimes we relive events we wish to forget, but there are stories that insist on staying with us, returning in moments of silence like a distant echo. What I'm about to tell you today happened to me a few years ago, and to this day, I haven't found a satisfactory explanation. Good night, everyone. Good evening to all the viewers on the channel. My name is Mark. I'm French, but I've lived in Germany for many years. I've worked as a nurse for over a decade, and like many other professionals, I've seen things I'd rather not remember. But nothing compares to what happened during a night shift at an old hospital in Hamburg. Before I continue, I'd like to ask you to leave a like on the channel and subscribe. Your support is very important so that stories like this can continue to be shared. I started my career in private hospitals, where everything seemed more organized and predictable. But in 2018, I received an offer to work in a public hospital that urgently needed professionals. The salary was attractive, and even though I knew the workload would be heavier, I accepted. The hospital had been built in the early 20th century, and despite renovations, it retained a particular atmosphere. From the first day, I noticed that the hallways were narrower, and the windows, though large, didn't seem to let in enough light. The building had a disused wing on the 7th floor that no one talked much about. The hallways ended with locked doors, and the few people who had worked there the longest avoided giving details. I asked a colleague about this part of the hospital, but he simply shrugged and changed the subject. During the 3rd week, I was assigned to the night shift. It wasn't my preference, but I had no choice. I arrived at 10 p.m. and exchanged a few words with the receptionist, a kind woman named Katerina. The janitor, an older man named Walter, was sitting near the entrance. At the end of the hallway, I saw a patient walking alone. which surprised MIT was rare to see someone wandering unaccompanied. I continued my routine, registering patients and checking medical records. Around 2 a.m., I went to the elevators to go to the ground floor and retrieve medications left in storage. The elevator was descending from the 7th floor, which intrigued me because that wing was supposed to be deactivated. The doors opened, and to my great surprise, the elevator was empty. I stood still for a moment, feeling unease growing inside me. I pressed the button to go down, but something made me look at the digital screen indicating the floor. For a second, I thought I saw a strange reflection in the metal doors. Perhaps it was just fatigue. When I reached the ground floor, I picked up what I needed and returned to my post, trying to ignore this strange feeling. But it was only the beginning. That same night, after the elevator incident, I tried to focus on my work. I still had several tasks to complete before the end of my shift, and I didn't want my mind to be clouded by this strange feeling. However, even though I tried to ignore it, something deeply bothered me. My colleague on duty that night, Elias, noticed I was agitated. He had been working there longer than me and seemed more accustomed to the oppressive atmosphere of the hospital. When we crossed paths in the hallway, he gave me a curious look. "You okay, Mark? You look a bit pale." I hesitated before answering. I wasn't sure if I should tell him what had happened, but I finally decided to do so. "Have you ever seen something strange in the elevator? Something that shouldn't happen?" Elias stopped walking and looked at me more closely. After a brief silence, he sighed. "You're not the first to notice," he said in a low voice, "but my advice, don't look for it." His response only increased my unease. Before I could ask anything else, an urgent call came over the intercom. A patient in room 312 had tried to get up alone and had fallen. I rushed to help, and the conversation with Elias was postponed. The night went on normally until 4:30 a.m. when I went to get coffee in the break room. The hospital was silent, with only the occasional sound of equipment filling the hallways. Fatigue was weighing on my shoulders, but something made me glance at the elevator control panel as I crossed the main hallway. And there it was again. The same elevator from earlier was on the 7th floor. This time, I stood there, watching the minutes pass, and nothing happened. The elevator didn't descend. It didn't move. It was frozen there, as if someone had called it, but it had never left. My heart raced. It could have been a technical issue, of course, but the feeling that something was wrong was too strong to ignore. Without overthinking it, I decided to investigate. I quickly gathered my belongings and rushed out of the room, nearly tripping over myself in my haste. As I made my way down the corridor, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift and move, playing tricks on my mind. Back in the safety of the main building, I found a few colleagues still working late. They noticed my distress immediately. "What happened?" one of them asked, concern etched on their faces. I saw him," I stammered, struggling to find the words. In the old building, their expressions changed from concern to unease. One of them, an older teacher who had been at the school for years, sighed heavily. "You shouldn't have gone there alone," he said quietly. "That place holds memories, ... and perhaps more." Despite their attempts to comfort me, I couldn't shake the encounter from my mind. Over the next few days, I avoided the old building entirely, sticking to the bustling areas of the school where students and teachers congregated. Yet, even amidst the noise and activity, I couldn't escape the lingering sense that something or someone was watching me as time passed. The initial shock began to fade, replaced by a gnawing curiosity. Who was this student? Why did no one talk about him? And why did his presence still haunt the school? Determined to uncover the truth, I started asking discreet questions, piecing together fragments of information from various sources. Some teachers remembered him vaguely, describing him as quiet and withdrawn. Others claimed they didn't recall him at all, which only added to the mystery. Eventually, I discovered that the student had indeed attended the school, but his records were sparse and incomplete. It was as if the administration had deliberately erased parts of his existence. This realization sent shivers down my spine. What could possibly warrant such an action? One evening, after most of the staff had left, I decided to revisit the old building. Armed with a flashlight and a renewed determination, I ventured inside. The familiar scent of dust and decay greeted me, but this time I was prepared. Navigating through the dimly lit corridors, I reached the room where I had found the notebook. Pushing open the door, I stepped inside, half expecting to see the figure again. Instead, I found another notebook lying on the desk, identical to the first. With trembling hands, I opened it, revealing pages filled with frantic scribbles and desperate pleas for help. Among the chaos, one sentence stood out: "They won't let me leave." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Whatever had happened to this student, it was clear that his story was far from over. And somehow, I felt compelled to uncover the rest of it, no matter how unsettling it might be. See you tomorrow.